So allow me to say a very good evening from Kampala. I think it's morning in Washington, but a very good evening from Kampala here. Very good morning to you if you're in Washington and on the other side of the world. A very good afternoon if you're elsewhere in between. And warm welcome to this symposium. We shall be raising big questions. What is the impact of these COVID-19 lockdowns on the freedom of worship? We shall be asking whether believers are setting a dangerous precedent by allowing the state to determine how to worship or when to worship. We shall be asking what are the options available to believers as a way forward amidst all that we see here, but still we're a mint. Somebody might be asking, why are we even debating this? I mean, can't you see what is happening? Why would you ask such questions in the amidst all that you see? Those are big questions coming along. And in between, we just might want to ask, if we talk about religious freedom amidst the lockdown, maybe a question in the back of our minds will be, with all the talk about essential workers, God may not be a worker, but is he still essential in the world today amidst this lockdown? Because we talk about religious freedom, then we're basically pointing to God and say, where is he in all this? Is he still essential? Do we still need to call upon him amidst all this? And maybe that could be informing some decisions that are being made. Is the church essential in this, amidst all that we see? Is the church essential? Must people still go to church? Do they need to go to church? Is God being acknowledged amidst all this? So welcome to this symposium. It should not take us more than the length of time a football match takes. So because we have lockdown Kampala here, as most of you may know, and so we have about just a little under 90 minutes to have this discussion. But very good evening to you all. My name is Gawaya Tegule. I'm an attorney at law here in Kampala. And joining us tonight or today or this morning, depending on where you are, we have a high-powered panel. They'll be introducing themselves a little later once we get to that, telling us more about where they are and what they do. But we have Sean Nelson coming to us from the Alliance Defending Freedom USA. Sean, happy to see you and great to have you on board.
Good, thank you, Gawaya.
Okay, great. And joining us as well, apparently from Austria, the Alliance from the Alliance Defending Freedom Austria, we have Lois McLachie. Lois, I must apologize. I do not know how to pronounce your name correctly. I hope I'm not doing too badly, but I hope that
you got it
not
perfect.
Too bad, right?
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Okay, great. Thank you for finding time to be with us today. We're happy to have you. I also want to go to Scotland, where I have a religious leader there, and he's acknowledged as Canon Tom White. Is Tom with us yet, or is he still on his way?
Unfortunately, Canon Tom had an issue last minute that he's unable to join us today, but I'll be able to speak about his story during my section. So hopefully I can do him some justice.
Okay, great. Very informative there, but we're happy that you'll be telling his side of the story. Then let me just go closer to home here. Ladies first, I have Policy Advisor Colonel Ann Tendo. Ann, are you with us?
Thank you very much, Mr. Gawaya. Yes, I am here and I'm happy to be part of this.
Okay, fantastic. And last but not least, as a human rights lawyer, well, that makes two of us here, Simon Senyonga. Simon, are you with us?
Yes, Gawaya, I am here with you. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, great. Simon, why don't I start right with you? Just tell us a little about yourself before I go to the panelists as well. A little about yourself.
Sorry, Gawaya, I lost you in that. I didn't get you very well. Could you please repeat the question?
No, I'm saying, can you just tell us a little about yourself, who you are, what you do?
Well, I think as earlier on introduced, you said it very well. I'm a human rights lawyer and a Christian, born again Christian. I'm very enthusiastic about the freedom of worship. And I mean, I love the Lord very much. Yeah. Thank you. I think
Great.
that is.
Well, thank you for making time with us, Simon. We do appreciate. Are you attached to any particular organization or law firm?
Not any at the moment, though I work with the Zoe Fellowship Ministries, which is widely known as the Prophet Elvis Mbonya Ministries.
Okay, your network is getting a little sticky there, but we'll be getting back to you a little later.
Gawaya, should I repeat that?
No. I think we got you here. Only that towards the end, your network was getting a little groggy. But happy to have you on board.
Thank you.
Yes, please feel at home. And let me go to Anne. Anne, a little about yourself. Anne Tendel.
Yes, please.
Tell us a little about who you are and what you do.
Oh, I am a lawyer as well, a Christian lawyer, and currently I work with Crown Co. Limited, a legal consultancy, in the position of a policy analyst and advisor. And I really have a lot of interest in religious freedoms. So I'm happy to be a part of this talk. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Later in the show, we shall be comparing notes about how different societies or countries have handled this issue of the lockdown with regards to religious freedom or the freedom of worship. Allow me to go to Sean. Sean, a little about yourself, please. In Washington, what do you do?
Hi, Gawaya. So for everyone, it's good to be chatting with you all, especially on the other side of the world. And you know, I have a big fondness for Uganda and for Africa, and I love getting to chat with folks and work with you all. So I really appreciate everything that all of you are doing, especially for freedom of religion or belief. I think it's very important. And I'm legal counsel on our freedom team at ADF International. There's a bit of a misstatement on the flyer, but I am in Washington, D.C., but I work on our international team. And so our team focuses on a number of different regions, Middle East and North Africa, Asia, and then sub-Saharan Africa. We also focus on working with lawyers, like so many here, and really building up a large alliance of lawyers that are out there every day working to protect religious freedom on the ground for people of all faiths. And often we're working in places where they're the most difficult circumstances for these lawyers, but we want to work with lawyers all across the world. And so we also do a lot of policy stuff here in DC when it comes to kind of international facing issues. So again, really excited to be here, and thank you for having me.
Great, happy to have you on board, Sean. It's a pleasure. Allow me to go to Lois. Lois, let me get this right. You're in Austria, no?
That's right. Thank you, Gawaya. I am in Vienna, Austria, which is the headquarters of ADF International. So I have the privilege of serving alongside Sean and many others for ADF International, which, as Sean outlined, is a faith-based legal advocacy organization which supports fundamental freedoms and protects the human dignity of all people. And so I come from a human rights background, but I now work in media, and I advocate for religious freedom in different journalistic outlets. I've had the privilege of serving on some campaigns to overturn worship bans in other countries around the world. So I'll be excited to share some of that with you and hope that it can be helpful in your situation too.
Okay, great. Let me stay with you right there, Lois, on this very important matter. What has been your observation in terms of how various countries have handled religious freedom during these COVID lockdowns?
So I think there's been a real journey across the world when we look at the way that religious freedom has been treated during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, when we were, sitting last March, when COVID-19 headlines started to come across our television screens, I think there's acknowledgement across the world that governments just simply didn't know how to handle the situation. We'd never been in a global pandemic before in our lifetime. And I think a lot of churches have some leniency towards that time when churches were firstly shut down due to health concerns. However, as we'll be discussing, in international human rights law, freedom of religion and belief is a fundamental freedom and should only ever be limited as is necessary and proportionate to protect people. So therefore, it became quite apparent as we journeyed through the pandemic that a blanket ban on all places of worship was far too extreme, especially when churches and other places of worship could mitigate risks through things like social distancing and hand washing. It also became apparent that across the world, other places like supermarkets and pharmacy shops and other places of commerce were able to stay open safely. So it became clear across the world that a blanket ban on worship was not appropriate in any country. And that's when ADF International began to be able to partner with Christians and people of faith on the ground to be able to advocate for their freedom and overturn worship bans across the world.
Yes, and you've raised the point of legal considerations. What law should we deem applicable in the circumstances if you look at the global context?
Well, when we look at international law, we can consider human rights treaties such as the ICCPR, which is one of the most widely ratified human rights treaties in the world. And Uganda ratified this itself in 1995. And in the ICCPR, in Article 18, it protects freedom of religion and belief. So we know that it is a very, very highly important right to be protected, to be prioritized over and above other things like shopping or going out for entertainment. Religious freedom is something that's special and must be protected to the greatest extent possible. So that's what we can look at when we're deciding these things internationally.
Great. Let me go to Sean. And Sean, would you share a similar sentiments, or would you want to depart a little from what Lois is saying? Looking at the legal considerations, what should we be considering at this time, given the magnitude of the pandemic that everybody agrees has been really, really bad to humankind at this point in time?
I would absolutely agree with everything that Lois has said, and I think she really laid it out very clearly what the international legal requirements are for restrictions on freedom of religion or belief. In fact, in these international legal documents, freedom of religion or belief is considered a non-derogable right. So even in times of emergency, which I think is especially early on and even continuing in some areas, that you can't just get rid of that right. You can't just throw it away. And in fact, in the documents themselves and in authoritative commentary on it, as Lois said, what you're looking for when you're considering restrictions and whether a restriction is a just restriction or whether it's unjust and shouldn't be allowed is whether the restriction is proportionate to the harm, whether it is necessary to stem the harm, whether it's non-discriminatory as well. And I think that's one element. It's something that we've seen in a lot of countries, right? Is that there were certain places that are very similar to churches in the amount of people that can gather in terms of shopping markets or shopping malls or different kinds of facilities. In one case in the US, it was actually casinos were allowed to operate while churches were closed and were more restricted. And that seems to be plainly discriminatory. And so you have these kind of two aspects, right? You have the basic idea of whether freedom of religion or belief, the ability to worship in community together, is something that can be restricted, absent all of those particular requirements in international law, right? And it's a fundamental right. It's non-derogable, and if you don't meet those very strict requirements, then no, you shouldn't be restricting it. At least in terms of an entire ban. Certainly, there are going to be reasonable precautions that everybody needs to take and can actually take. But when it comes to an actual ban, that seems to be very strong. And I'm not sure. In fact, I don't believe that the actual situation warrants that extreme of a measure. Then there's also the non-discriminatory ground as well, which is that if you're saying that some places are you can go around and you can do this safely, you can do it with whatever the restrictions are, social distancing or masking or whatever it might be, but you can't do that at church. That seems to be a very strange thing, and we seem to have gotten our priorities mixed up. Freedom of religion is fundamental. What do we mean by that? We mean that it's foundational to who we are as human beings, right? It is something that comes before any other right that the state might grant. It's foundational to who we are, and it's something that we have naturally. And the freedom of worship is being able to worship directly with your Creator, whatever God you choose. That's a fundamental thing. And if the state decides, well, we don't think that's as important as going to pick up alcohol at the local ABC store or going to a casino, that doesn't seem right. That seems very discriminatory. So those are, I think, the two major priorities that anyone who's developing, what they're trying to figure out with how churches or any other group, mosques, synagogues, any religious house of worship is trying to decide is this really necessary? Is it proportional? And is it non-discriminatory? If you fail any of those grounds, then you need to rethink what you're doing.
Great. We're talking about protecting freedom of worship, and we're having reflections on the closure of places of worship during COVID-19 lockdowns. Basically it's happening all over the world that places of worship are being restricted, and arguments coming through why restrict places of worship and the supermarkets are open and the kind of thing. The issues of non-discrimination, the issues of proportionality, the issues of necessity. Is this really necessary? Things that we shall be talking about as we go along. And like I said, I'm joined by Sean Nelson from the US, Antendo here in Kampala, Lois Maklachi in Vienna, Austria, and Fenam Sanyonga also here in Kampala. And I'm Gawaya Segule, who is taking you through the next several minutes as we raise fundamental questions about what is happening. But allow me to go back to Lois. You are nodding your head as Sean spoke. And I'm asking myself, do you consider, from your perspective, do you see this as an attack on freedom of worship? Or can we argue it around and about or around it as simply a measure taken for the good of everybody concerned? Because nobody disputes the fact that coronavirus is dangerous. Lois.
Now, we can all agree that at this time it's extremely important to be taking care of each other and to be taking care of our families. But what we've seen across the world when we've been taking on these cases is that Christians and other religious people are actually being discriminated against and having a restriction that other places don't have. As Sean said, there was even a case in the US where a casino was left open, whereas churches were closed. So this, at this point, doesn't become just about keeping people safe, but there is clearly a not fair playing field here between what is considered an important right. The right to religious freedom is not considered as important as keeping a casino open or as other entities in Scotland too, where we had a significant overturn of a worship ban that was largely hinging on an argument where they were keeping places open where juries could sit to listen to trials. So the judge said, well, if a jury can sit in a socially distanced, manageable way, a congregation can gather to hear a trial, then surely a congregation can gather to hear a sermon. So at that point, it does become an unfair playing field, and it does become about the right to religious freedom being seen as less important. And we really have to take this opportunity to make sure that in an emergency situation of all situations, human rights are respected, because if they aren't respected now, Gawaya, it's unlikely that if we have a situation like this again in a few months, in a few years, that we'll be able to have respect for religious freedom again.
Okay, great. I see messages coming in. I think we have Richard Kaketo, who is in Nairobi, and says good evening. I also have Liz Elizabeth. She says good evening from Kampala. She's excited to be on this forum today. And you can just send us a message on this and let us know where you are listening to us from, so that we can say hello and welcome you officially on board. let me get closer to home here. Simon, human rights lawyer. Simon, are you with us still?
Yes, I'm around. I'm here.
You've been listening to Lois and Sean. What's your take on their arguments?
Let me see if I can get my video on, and I hope I can just be seen quite well. I'm hoping my audio is loud enough.
No, you're fantastic.
First of all, I agree with the position advanced by my two colleagues. Maybe the advancement of that is much more contextualized in the international human rights perspective. When you look at the Ugandan context, I think the freedom of worship is still protected under Article 29 of our Constitution. But as we all very well know, that our Constitution has a general limitation clause under Article 43 of the Constitution, which talks about limitations for public interest under public health. However, there is that test which has been called the limitation upon the limitation. So we have a limitation on our fundamental human rights, but there is a greater limitation, which is this should be exercised under an acceptable, when it's acceptable and it's acceptable in a free and democratic, acceptable and demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic state. Now, I think that is what Sean was laboring to explain, that test that we talk about. However, in dealing with this particular aspect of the freedom of worship, I think it's important that we take into consideration the historical perspective of the Ugandan nation and how it has previously responded to the freedom of worship. When you look at the making of our constitution and the reading of the 1995 Odoki Commission report, the Constitutional Committee report, you will realize that there wasn't much credence that was given to the freedom of worship. So there was a generality in terms of the discussion of the human rights context in our nation. One of the biggest debates that we grapple with in this nation is that we have a set of British colonized sort of, conservative judges who definitely, you would say, respect the freedom of worship. However, most of the times there has been a political context and interpretation to this particular right. And why do I say that? You can read into the statements of the president ahead of the declaring of the lockdown. I think over time, from March 2020, when we went to the first lockdown, the president's position was quite clear that you need not to gather for you to worship. You can always, you can meet wherever, you can be wherever you are, and you can pray from your homes, your areas of worship, anywhere that you are. So the freedom of worship has been given a very deep political context and has been strongly justified by a militaristic approach in terms of the execution of the human rights. I need not remind us that our president has come out very clearly, and I think a couple of politicians, to actually bastardize the discussion of the human rights perspective. They take it as something light, they take it as something that is not very important. I think all other things can be important, but that. But the biggest question that actually I realize that we grapple with in the freedom of worship is that maximum protection is majorly realized in international human rights instruments. Now we have the question of it must be Article 45 of our Constitution, which imports international human rights law to become applicable in Uganda. However, we have a challenge that some of our judges have refused to recognize that actually international human rights law should be directly imported into our constitution. So most of the times when they are weighing this the interpretation concerning the freedom of worship, it is normally skewed to only preserve the strong limitations under Article 43 of our constitution. And yet I need to remind us that we have a legal obligation under the national objectives and directive principles of state policy, which are further enforced under Article 8A of the Constitution of Uganda, as those which can be now, which can actually be enforced as law. So the spirit of the law in the Ugandan context has faced major setbacks. The human rights law has faced major setbacks because of, number one, the politicization of the human rights argument, the human rights context. Secondly, the conservative perspective of our judges. But I think also there hasn't been massive interest and vigor in litigating on the freedom of worship. I think we really have minimal human rights cases concerning the freedom of worship. So we find ourselves in a situation whereby we haven't done so much to realize this right. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you, Simon. I'll be staying with you. But allow me to recognize those who are just joining us. I have Naomi from Entebbe saying hello. I have Hosea from Mukono, that's about 20 kilometers from here in Kampala, saying hello. I have Tenyo Dennis, also in Kampala. I have Susan Otakingira in Padere, northern Uganda. I have Jane Katisia in Mombasa, Kenya. I have Agnes Waeno from Bwegere, not far from Kampala here. So welcome on board, and please enjoy the discussion as we talk about protecting freedom of worship, reflections on the closures of places of worship during COVID-19. And like I said, we're a highly international panel here. I have Sean in the US, I have Lois in Austria, I have Anne and Simon here in Kampala. We should have been joined by Tom White from Scotland, but Lois told us he's indisposed today, but she was telling us a little bit about him. But let me go to Anne, who has been quiet so far in this discussion. And I'm saying, Anne, is this, from what Simon is saying, let me distill the issues. Are we talking about limitations on worship or limitations on assembly? Because people are worshiping at home. Somebody says you can pray from home, you can pray from wherever you are. And which one are we discussing? The worship itself or the assembly in order to worship? And
thank you, Mr. Gawaya. What I have to say about the limitations maybe is what we're dealing with right now is limitation that goes to the root of the very right. Something which regional courts have actually decided upon and said, in limiting a right that can be limited, if you go to the very root of the right and you take away the very ability for people to exercise that right, then that limitation is not acceptable. And when you come to Uganda here, for example, if I'm to put into context what happened last year in 2020 around July, when the general lockdown was lifted, all the other places were opened up strictly on the understanding that they will implement some simple SOPs like making sure people wash hands and making sure that they have masks on. But places of worship remained closed for an extended period of time under the context that the president was still consulting with some religious leaders. Also, I think the question we are grappling with right now is whether the right to health reigns supreme over other rights during times of pandemics like the ones that we're dealing with right now. And unlike the literature that has been shared widely online, I'm of the view that other rights cannot be shut out even in times of pandemics. And I think we can see the Ugandan context. Let me first bring the Ugandan context on board because it's not really different from what I think Lois and Sean have explained. You have places like malls that are opened without a limitation on the number of people that can be in a mall. There's no one at the entrance that is counting to make sure that it's a maximum of either 70 people or 200 people entering a mall. You have unruly places like the downtown markets and places like Chikuvo, which is also a downtown shopping area that do not have limitations on the number of people that can actually engage in business right there. And then you have places of worship where you have restrictions on the number of people that can be there from 70, I understand it went to 200, but still there are congregations that are way, way larger than that were affected. And you have limitations on children and elderly people being told to stay at home and not attend prayers whether it is a church, whether it is a mosque, whether it is whatever place of worship you can think of. And we do not have scientific evidence to show us that if children or elderly people go to places of worship, they will contract COVID faster than when they go to a market downtown or to a mall. And I think for me, I at this point, I need to call out the selfishness of the Ugandan people, because once they go there and they realize, oh, my children are not allowed to actually attend, it will hurt them once, but then eventually they will conform. And, you know, because they feel like for them, they are able to attend, it's not something that is going to, you know, make them uncomfortable, and realize that everyone has a right to access and enjoy what I am enjoying right now. And I think our religious leaders may not know, the people that purport to be religious leaders that are being consulted may not know that actually they are participating in handing over our rights to be violated. And going back to the statement you...
So, Anne, can I interject here a little? Did you hear me, Anne?
Yes, please. Okay,
Yes, I'm asking, let me just put something to you. If at all you're talking about the derogation of the right to worship, and Mr. Museveni's message to the country when he was opening up the first time last year was, please do not die. That was something he repeated over and over. Now, what is the benefit of enjoying the freedom to worship when in going to worship, you just might end up dead, in which case you'll have no right to enjoy it since you won't be here anymore?
Sorry, I'm not getting you very well.
What is the import? What is the benefit of being allowed to worship freely and then ending up dead? Because the nature, I think, of congregations, that it's usually and quite understandably difficult to observe SOPs. I missed you, there's a hug here, there's a handshake here, and sometimes people let their hair down because there's a free atmosphere in church.
Number one, the point I was trying to make earlier, I think, is the fact that places of worship are actually able to control the crowds in attendance more easily than the places that are being allowed to operate freely, like the downtown markets and all. Nonetheless, when you look at rights like the freedom of worship, it number one, it has an element of the right to manifest and the right to one conscience. The question that you're asking me is similar to a question where you have is it the Jehovah Witnesses who don't believe in blood transfusion, and you know, you're telling them you have a right to accept or reject medical attention in cases where you are supposed to get blood transfusion, and someone has a right to say, no, I don't want blood transfusion because it goes against my belief. I think we are dealing with a similar situation here, and it's a matter of whether people can be able to discipline themselves. It's a matter of belief, because you have people who believe that their God reigns supreme over some of the things that are being shown here. And I think we have some leaders who are showing a degree of selfishness and telling people to stay home, pray from home, and then the very same people are being shown on videos during prayers on Sundays and whatever days, having direct access to the homes of the leaders that are leading prayers. So I think for me, what we're dealing with right now is a conflict between socioeconomic, cultural rights and civil and political rights, but also a nation that is being ill-advised by people who purport to know what ought to be done, but have not paid attention to what actually is the right thing to do. Thank you.
Okay, great. Protecting freedom of worship, and we're having reflections on closures of places of worship during COVID-19. My name is Gawai Tegule, and I'm joined by Sean Nelson from the US, Ann Tendo in Kampala, Lois McClatchy in Austria, and of course, Simon Senyonga here in Kampala. And I'm also joined from Kenya, we have David Kamoto. David, welcome on board. And I also have from Kakumiro in Uganda, Alvin Akuhura, welcome aboard. Brian Tembo in Kampala, welcome aboard, and Angela Karunji, welcome aboard. At this point, you can begin sending in your questions to the panelists, and I'll be inviting the panelists to answer them in a few minutes down the road as we go along. But allow me to go back to the US, where I would like Sean Nelson to talk to us about are believers setting a dangerous precedent by allowing the state to determine how to worship or when to worship. Sean, would that be the case in this kind of scenario?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that in the early part of the pandemic, right, this was a very new virus, and people didn't know exactly what was going to be happening with it. They didn't know where it was coming from. They didn't know what caused it. They were getting all sorts of different messages about how transmissible it was, how dangerous it was, what would happen if you got it, because there was a very wide range of different symptoms and different reactions, right? There was also the concern about asymptomatic spread, which is something that seemed very new at the time, especially last year. And so I think there was a sense by a lot of people that, hey, this is something new. We need to do something and we don't quite know what to do. And when you get in that kind of reacting mode, then sometimes you'll make bad decisions. Sometimes you'll do missteps. And then sometimes some people will take advantage of those things. Here in the US, actually, the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a major consulting body for the US Congress, has talked about how COVID restrictions have been used to harm various religious communities all throughout the world. And so there is that concern that when a religious community says, you know what, we're going to go ahead and shut down for a little while, that's something that every religious community has the right to, right? They also have the right to determine when they are able to worship in community and when they're not. That's part of it. And if a church or a mosque decides that, we just don't know quite yet, and let's hold back, I think that's okay. But when it comes to the state saying that, we really don't think that it's safe for you specifically to do this thing, but it's okay for grocery stores and different groups to do that. If you really begin to wonder, why is that okay? And I think you see then churches and different religious communities saying no, like this is a fundamental, important right. This is something that we cherish, and we're going to keep worshiping when you have those restrictions. And so we've seen in a lot of places, and ADF and ADF International have been very happy to help on many of those cases where houses of worship did fight back on onerous restrictions. And I think you also saw something really interesting throughout the, I think you saw something very interesting throughout the pandemic, which was that churches were very interested in worshiping and connecting with their congregations, right? So they would have in-person services if they could. I know that at my church, they were very strict about it. We were given towels and squirt guns to wipe down everything. People were checking it throughout the whole time. The second that we were able to, they were right on it and following everything, because it's such an important right to give thanks to God. You also had them, a lot of places, installing cameras so that people who were less comfortable or who were particularly vulnerable or felt they were particularly vulnerable or concerned, that they could then participate at home in worship through that. But it's if the state just said everybody has to do one kind of worship, I think that is going too far, and churches and other houses of worship should resist that in the proper legal manners that they can. And I think that's something that we need to see. We need to see different faith leaders standing up and say, look, this is a serious thing. we're taking it seriously. We can do this safely. We need to be able to worship God in community safely and really stand together on that.
Great. Thank you, Sean. Let me just go to the inbox here. I see Liz Elizabeth saying, if people are not dying in markets and malls, what makes you think they will die in places of worship? I think the state, like in Uganda here, is deliberately robbing us of our right to worship because churches are more organized than malls and markets, and SOPs can be better observed here. Agnes Wayano is saying, I agree with you, Liz. It's an issue of fairness. The lockdown guidelines don't seem to be fair to all the sectors. And Lois says, I'd like to add a thought to this. Lois, I'm getting actually right. You're the next in queue on that one. So I want to hear what you're saying on that one.
Fantastic.
Yes, why don't you take it from right there, Lois?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here. I'd love to add a little perspective from some of the other places where we've taken a challenge to a worship ban, because it has been a question internationally. Are Christians being irresponsible? Are we being unhealthy? Well, our question to that is, are Christians or other religious people more contagious than everyone else? And we've posed that question to influential people. Now in Scotland, when we took a successful case to overturn the worship ban with Canon Tom White, an MP, a member of Parliament who agreed with our campaign, asked in Parliament to those who were responsible for COVID-19 measures. She said, what is the data to say that churches are so dangerous that they must be shut down while other places of commerce are not? And the government could not provide an answer. They said there was no available data to support the argument that churches were so much more dangerous than other places. Whereas in fact, it's been clear across the world, as Sean was saying, that churches are very, very willing to take the measures that are necessary to allow them to worship safely. Now, when we zoom across over the water to Switzerland, which is also just across the water in Europe, we also challenged a worship ban in what is known as the hub of human rights in Geneva, where many of you will know where the Human Rights Council is based. Well, the city of Geneva at the start of the pandemic had shut down all places of worship, despite other activities being able to take place. And actually, the people who were able to challenge that ban were not only Christians. There was Christians involved, there was other people of different faith backgrounds involved from the Jewish community and others. And there was also a doctor who was working on a COVID ward. And doctors of all people should be able to answer this question, or is going to church putting the population at significantly more risk than allowing them to go to a supermarket or any other place of commerce? And he was able to say, as a doctor, no, I don't, as a person who is caring for COVID patients day in, day out, trying to make sure the population remains safe as possible, I can see that there is a need to not only protect our physical health as a nation, which is important, but also to protect our mental and spiritual health. And I know that's been an important point for many of our clients taking cases forward across the world, and I believe in Uganda too, that physical health is important, but spiritual health of each person is extremely important too. And if we're not able to do basic things like worship the God of our choice, then we're not enjoying the freedom that the physical health allows us to have anyway. So it really is that important.
Let me just share with you, Lois, on this one. So you're saying that litigation against government in this lockdown in various countries, or in a few countries, has been quite successful, right?
Yes, indeed. We had our first successful lift of a worship ban in Scotland, where my home country. We had that in March of this year. Now there was a priest, Mr. Canon Tom White, who's hoping to join us today, but was unavailable. Now he was a parish priest in a very deprived area of Glasgow, inner city Glasgow. And he was looking around his parish and he saw that there was a lot of suffering. It was an area of extreme suffering in Scotland without a pandemic to start with. And the pandemic made things greatly worse for them. And he saw that his community were suffering. He wasn't able to shepherd his people. He wasn't able to comfort people who were grieving, who had lost loved ones. In the chaos and the confusion and the mental health crisis that has come along with COVID-19, people were not able to reach a source of comfort and hope in the community. And he thought, why must the government take that away at such a critical time as this, when we need the church in our lives more than ever, many would say. So he mounted a legal challenge. He didn't have much, but he consulted his community. He contacted us to support him. And we were able to join with other faith leaders, 27 other faith leaders from across the country. And we took a successful challenge forward based on the arguments of proportionality, based on the arguments of international human rights law. Now, if a country has signed a human rights law treaty, that's very significant and important, and the government is obliged to make sure that they uphold those commitments. So we challenged the government, and actually the night before the ruling came down, the government said that churches could open. And I think that was a lot due to public pressure, as people had supported Canon Tom, heard his arguments and his reasoning, and joined in their voices of support. So the night before, the government said that churches were able to open on that Sunday, but the court went ahead and ruled in our favor the next day anyway, and said that the government's ban had been unlawful. It had been against the law. So that was our first success, and that had a real domino effect across the globe. It was just the next day when in Chile, in South Africa, across the world, a country that most of us in Scotland had never been to, they used some of the arguments that had been used in Scotland, the proportionality argument, arguing that why should alcohol shops, should supermarkets, should other places of commerce be allowed to thrive when people are not allowed to simply sit in a big, airy, spacious church, single file if they need to, and sit in a church. And that court in Chile recognized that freedom of worship was a human right. It was being unfairly eroded, and they ruled in our favor too. It was only a few weeks later that we had success in Switzerland, and we've seen these bans fall across the world. So it really is important that governments who are sitting with these bans right now take note of these decisions that have been made by courts internationally. Take note that they are unlawful according to human rights law, and therefore don't make the same mistakes that we've seen up here in the West and in Latin America, and make sure that they do not continue to impinge on human rights in an inappropriate way.
Okay, great. Lois, looks like you're already offering prescriptions that's simply available that people can take up. I want to know from Simon and Anne whether this would be viable in an African context, especially given the fact that many of our governments are not exactly democratic. Many of them are not exactly responsive to public sentiment and public pressure, and given the fact that many of them even ignore court orders. But without biasing you, let me start with Simon. Do you think litigation is a viable option in the Ugandan context, and come to think of it, in a sub-Saharan African context?
Yes, well, I think it's something very viable, and it can be a success. Depending on which context you want to look at it from. I think we need to approach it from the angle of being pace setters in terms of realizing our commitments, our international obligations and commitments under the human rights framework. You see, the thing is that most of our courts have been reduced into mere paper tigers in a political context. That even receiving a judgment is one thing, but enforcing it is another thing. But you see, all that is not lost. I think, for one, we have had a series of progressive judges. We have had a series of progressive litigants who have picked much more interest in this particular case. But the question you pose begs one thing from my side: the level and the strategy of how nations impose restrictions on the freedom of worship. We need, in terms of contextualizing this, you have to realize that for some nations, especially in the European context, the governments have given, have decided or have dictated how they will relate with the churches based on their historical context. So not so much freedom is given. I think Spain has been much more progressive, where the churches have been left to actually deal with their congregation. But let's come back home here. In the African context, the history of the church with the state or let me say religion and the state has been used majorly for extending political mandate. Now, because of that, normally religion has been used as a tool of weaponization. And because of the amount of social traction it can have, many of our governments, which are purely authoritarian, militaristic, and totalitarian, will be very afraid to actually show that this right should be exercised. You see, one of the things that we are grappling with in this current pandemic is that governments are trying to sanitize their international image. And because of that, there is a lot of massive political repression and suppression coming from these big entities. So I'll give you a simple example. The World Health Organization comes up and tells us that, look here, this virus came because it was a surprise to us. Politicians were surprised, epidemiologists were surprised, everyone was surprised. And the churches received the first label from the World Health Organization as the super spreader of the virus. Even without presenting the figures that actually, it was just because people gather, therefore when they gather, the virus easily spreads. Now, all this information has been churned out through governments, through the media. Now, at the very first instance, you're approaching the courts of law, which have been majorly biased, majorly infiltrated. We have cadre judges. So when you're dealing with the kind of the kind of contest that we have, the legal contest that we have in the African perspective, it is majorly the cadreship of the judiciary and whether they will be able to respond. Because even when you seek for redemption, say from regional human rights entities, most of them are majorly advisory, and there is not so much they can impose on highly entrenched, political systems which are biased towards pleasing, especially the Western. When I say the Western world, not talking about those who have been progressive in realizing this, right? But those who have been so quick to push for the curtailment of this particular right. So our political environment in Uganda is a major influencer of the judiciary. Okay. And most of them would not want to depart from the political authorities. So there is that fear that even when you are presenting the finest of the arguments, most of them are not willing to receive. But the most important thing is that the success of this litigation comes from us adopting a multi-pronged approach. We must know who we are taking on, if at all we are to take them on, if at all we ever choose that we are going to choose litigation as a path. You must be able to exercise the political tools. You must be able to use the media. You must be able to use even other clandestine means to be able to realize this right. So it's not a walk in the park for the realization of human rights. I know elsewhere, but it becomes even tougher. It becomes a much more rougher pack in Uganda or in Sub-Saharan countries.
Okay, great. I would like to go to Anne very shortly, but allow me to acknowledge those who are just joining us from other parts of this continent. We have Tobias in Nairobi, Kenya. Tobias, we're happy to see you. Welcome on board. I also have Jimilax Tashovia here in Kampala. And I also have a few messages here coming in. Agnes is saying it is important to speak to the facts in our situation as Uganda. 80% of the Ugandan population is under the age of 25. Research shows that this age bracket might get infected, but rarely have symptoms and rarely suffer adverse effects of the disease, including death. And this means that even if the infections might float around, people should be allowed to live their lives as it is in Tanzania. This demographic fact alone should be a reason not to worry that churches will transmit infections. And this is actually the reason why the disease might tear through Italy and other European countries, but seems to lose steam in Africa. And I would be hoping that Sean and Lois will react to that, given their context. Would like to hear your comments on that. Brian, I hear you. And then Agnes Dio says, secondly, Ugandans are religious by nature, with percentages going up to more than 90%. paying allegiance to some deity of whatever sort. Rarely do you find a Ugandan that does not attribute their success to God first. With the hopelessness in Africa, churches are the biggest source of comfort. Now imagine that this source of comfort is cut off. We now have increased cases of mental health challenges, and most of these institutions, mental health institutions, are full right now. Great. Liz Elizabeth is saying, oh yes, Agnes, we should also consider the virus has a 99% recovery rate. I'm not sure about that percentage, by the way. I thought it was a little close to 97%, but the scientists will tell us. Surely, unless the president tells us he's leaving the 99 and going after the one sheep, then Brian says, I think what to put first, each perspective is a place of worship, at least as we have known are the first places of belief. We have seen lots of people getting healing from churches countless times. Hospitals have been overwhelmed, and people enter them at free will, and yet thousands have died at those same hospitals, yet paying very hefty bills in a bid to stay alive. I believe that the lockdown, especially in the churches, downplayed the role of churches, which is offering this relief before it's even considered the place of worship. If we have had a history of people healing from churches, why not now? Tobias from Nairobi, Tobias Nairoki, he's saying, what should be done to lift shutdowns of churches in our countries when some governments are exaggerating the numbers of COVID-19 positive patients from Kenya? Naomi says, it's an undeniable fact that churches or places of worship are a place of comfort in these trying moments. Okay, but let me go to Anne before, there's so many messages coming in, but let me just go to Anne in terms of the practicality of litigation as a remedy in this difficult time for freedom of worship, and also what other options might be available. Anne.
Thank you. I still believe that litigation would be a very good strategy to get some of the results that we want. We can't completely write it off. Fine, we would go to court with a 50-50% chance of winning, but it's not something we can completely write off, because number one, we've had incidents where even if we did not get a win in court, we had reforms that were done by government in different cases to correct the wrong that they had done. There have been incidents where government notices that a case has been brought against it in a particular aspect, and it rushes to do particular reforms to sabotage a case. But in actual sense, I think personally, to me, that is a victory in its own. I do agree with Simon that sometimes courts play politics, but I think we shouldn't anticipate defeat at this level. There are some judges that are activists, and we can look to in case we need a good decision. But also, litigation is a way of mounting pressure and building advocacy in the eyes of the public and telling them that actually what is going on is wrong and you need to see it the way we are seeing it, because there are very many people out there who have simply accepted a situation not knowing that what is going on is actually wrong. So I wouldn't completely write off litigation. And when it comes to the regional and international bodies and litigation before them, I have also seen pressure being mounted on countries. And I think in addition to that is the aspect of embarrassment of countries. If the regional community or the international community actually gets to see that, my goodness, things are bad in this country. And I think the best example I can give is the recent Rwanda scenario before the African Court, where Rwanda actually rushed to try to withdraw its recognition of its declaration before the African Court of Human and People's Rights, because a certain lady had taken an application before it regarding abuse of her rights and the imprisonment that had been enforced, yet she was a political aspirant. And I think for me, that in itself is an example of things that could actually pan out from going to regional bodies. The pressure, the embarrassment of countries and governments in those bodies is something that could actually be a very good outcome to the cause that we could be looking for. And then the other aspect of what else can be done, because you said some of our leaders are stiff-necked, we could actually mobilize and partner with the ones that are not stiff-necked, partner with politicians that can actually make the kelele, the noise that we need, and help their colleagues to see what is actually wrong with what is being done. Because sometimes the leaders that we think are doing wrong are oblivious to the situation on ground and are simply listening to advisors close to them without knowing actually what is right and what is wrong. That is it for me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I want to go back to Sean and Lois, maybe not in that order, but just a couple of messages here. And the panelists, please feel free to react to any of the messages that you see coming through, because we may not be able to read all of them. Agnes, no, this is not Agnes. This is Tobias. No, I think it's Tobias. It's Naomi. Naomi was saying it's an undeniable fact that place of worship, a place of comfort. I think we dealt with that. But Jimena Tashovia is saying COVID-19 is the youngest industry. I like the wording of this one. He's calling it an industry besides HIV and malaria and others. However, it's in its infancy and it needs fear to thrive. And the media has been greatly instrumental in that. The reason why places of worship are a threat is because they offer hope and thus an antidote to the multi-million-dollar fear-mongering that we see in the media campaigns. Big question there. I would like to hear from Lois and Sean on that. Then Liz Elizabeth says, weaponizing religion is very sad, and also agrees that yes, church is actually a threat to those who are making money from COVID. Then Rita says, as much as litigation is viable, the international community needs to call out our governments and even impose sanctions if need be to ensure that the religious rights are upheld. And let me begin with you, Lois, before I go to Sean. What's your take on that as we ponder other practical solutions to this impasse that we're in?
Well, I'd say that there is an extent that we've seen that we're able to bring this matter to government's attention nationally. I think there's an interesting idea there of putting it to the international community to put pressure on the government, and that's certainly an interesting and possible thing to if there are international institutions who are able to point governments to human rights law. But governments are ultimately expected to be somewhat accountable to their people. And I think there's got to be pressure on the ground too, to make sure that it is seen that it is the people that want this. It is the people who need their right to religious freedom. And there's no reason, if it should have been won for people in Switzerland, for people in Scotland, for people in Chile, there's no reason why the people of Uganda should not also be able to enjoy their human rights. And I think that's really an important message to be putting forward throughout your communities. And if you decide to take this forward in litigation to the court, I think it's really, really important to be able to take that message forward, that it is you, the people, who need to be able to enjoy your religious freedom. So I'd say never underestimate that power.
And Gawai, I'll just follow on Lois's statements about the relationship with the international community. Last year, I mean, this summer feels like a repeat of last summer in Uganda and in a lot of parts of the world, unfortunately, where there was a lockdown in Uganda, and then there was a slow period of kind of very different SOPs that were going along, and then finally, after months, there was some movement and some opening up, and it was a very slow process. And my hope is that Ugandan government has learned from that, and that in the presidential statement tomorrow, that there'll be more positive developments, and that things will not be so restricted, and that things will begin opening up. But we'll see what happens there. When it comes to the international community, though, actually last year we did take a lot of initiatives to inform people around the world about what was happening in Uganda and what was happening in a lot of different places unfortunately, a lot of governments were not particularly concerned about these church closures because they were doing them themselves, right? They were ones who were interested in doing that. Again, there were some statements. Both the United Nations and the U.S. made statements about governments that use church closures to harass religious minorities and kind of keep them out of the political process or target them and say, hey, you're the ones causing COVID, you're the ones spreading that. And we saw that in a lot of countries, but we did not see many statements beyond that. And unfortunately, we did not see statements towards Uganda about that. But as Lois mentioned, you know, this is something where we really need people within individual countries to stand up and say, you know, we're not going to let you take our freedoms away, right? Because once you give away your freedoms, it's really hard to get them back, right? It's much better to keep what you have than to give it away and try to get it back. And so I think that's something where we just need people to say that, people to share that message, people to spread it around. And the more people say, look, we understand this is a serious situation, but we can worship together, we can do it safely, and we need to. This is essential. I'm really amazed at the comments. I think this is a very intelligent crowd. These are great comments and really interesting. And one theme that's really come through is how much comfort and care that people get from going to church, from going to their house of worship, and from spending time both with God and amongst a community of believers. And that's something where when you're isolated and you're scared, that can be something that really gets you through and unites an entire community, unites nations, helps bring people together to fight against what can be a very dangerous thing rather than isolating people and alienating them. And so I think that's a really important aspect of this, and another reason why Ugandans and people everywhere, especially people of faith, should be standing up and saying, no, we need our houses of worship open. We need these places where we can worship God and give thanks and send our prayers.
Great. Let me go back to Lois. Somebody here, I think it was Liz Elizabeth, saying, thank you, Lois. Yes, governments are expected to be accountable to the people. Unfortunately, that's not the case in Uganda because our leaders are not accountable to the people. I think the issue that comes forth from this is maybe the solutions that may work nicely in Scotland, in Austria, in America, may not be that easy to replicate in the sub-Saharan African context. What would you say about that?
I do appreciate that there's cultural differences. I do appreciate that very much. I was in your country not so long ago, just a few weeks ago. It was a beautiful country. I was grateful to be there. But I do think that there is, when there is opportunity to stand up for religious freedom, it is worth taking, no matter what that opportunity could be. And there is a system of judicial review. There is a judiciary that is available to you. There are methods and ways of being able to respectfully make points in the public sphere and to have voices heard. Now, I know that will look differently across the world, but when there is a chance to stand up for your freedoms, do it, because as Sean said so eloquently, once you have lost those freedoms, it is very, very hard to take them back, and you don't want to look back and say, oh, if only we tried. So I really would encourage you, if there is opportunity to stand up for people's right to go to church, to worship the living God, I urge you to stand up for that as much as you possibly can.
If I could just respond as well to this and just second what Lois is saying, and also that in every country, you know, there are specific opportunities and there are specific challenges. In Europe, there are different opportunities and challenges than in South America, than in the US, than in Asia, than in the Middle East, and then in sub-Saharan Africa, including Uganda. And as I've been discussing with a lot of the other panelists here in the last few weeks and chatting with other people in Uganda about what's going on, I think that we've identified a lot of those potential opportunities And as somebody in the comments mentioned, you know, Uganda is a country of faith, right? The vast majority of people are very strong in their faith. And so this should be a country where people can stand up and say, no, we want to protect our ability to freely worship. That's not the case in a lot of Western countries. In a lot of Western countries, people have forgotten, they've forgotten God. They've forgotten what it means to even go to church. They've forgotten the importance of what it means to go to church, or what it means to follow your God, follow your conscience, and worship. And so that makes it actually more difficult in some instances to convince somebody that, you know, that this is as essential for people as eating. This is as essential as shopping. But I think in Uganda, people get that. People know that innately. It's in the culture. It's amongst people. And so I think it's actually a perfect opportunity, even though there may be political issues, even though there may be issues with government or with some other actors. It's actually a great opportunity. I think in Uganda is one of the places where people can most firmly stand up for the right to religious freedom and freedom of worship. And so I'd really encourage everybody here who's on this call, you know, share this message, let other people know that they should be vocal about this. They should speak out and say, I want my church open. I want my mosque open. I want to make sure that we can worship in community together, because that's what's going to make the country stronger.
Great. Let me go to Anne and then to Simon, because as we draw close to the end of this, messages coming through, let me just read a couple of them. Joyce Katende says, I believe it's important to realize that people are not compartmentalized. We are whole, having a physical, mental, and spiritual aspect to all of us. To deny any one of them, then it's a violation of one's rights. To deny people an ability to socialize, to worship in unison, is denying our humanity. Secondly, the challenges we have is that governments are acting in a way that the COVID doesn't affect politicians or government officials. This is seen by the fact that that category of persons are allowed to move and even congregate to work, and yet the rest of the masses are not allowed to do so. COVID is not a selective disease, or in this case, a virus. It affects all equally. So if government can continue to work in government, continue to work as government, then we can also continue to worship and still stay safe. Viola says the fear of contracting disease, I think she needs to complete that. Then Alan Sirwaji, I think, from Kampala. A lot of people concentrate on the freedom of rights, which affects them physically in Uganda. Anything which has to do with psychological stature and faith, people easily compromise it, unless many come up to create awareness so that people can stand up for their faith and psychologically state. Let me go to Anne. Anne, you're in policy advisory and public relations. Do you think it is possible for people in a country like Uganda to stand up for their rights and put it together and say, look, we really want to go back to church. We really want to go back to worship wherever we are going to worship. Is that possible given the political circumstances under which we live and operate? Anne?
Thank you. I think it is very possible for the people to mount pressure. Again, I don't think it is for us to completely write off the power of the public, because we've seen it working in very many other countries in Africa. We've seen it in Sudan and in different countries where people have risen up and said enough is enough. And, you know, if change is not implemented, other options are done. And I hope it doesn't come to that in Uganda. But it's very possible for the people to rise up and say, we want to go back to church, we want to go back to our mosques. And it's very possible for the leaders to listen. Secondly, I imagine a scenario where all places of worship decide to boycott the orders and open up and hold church. How many people are they going to arrest? How many people are they going to put in cells at the moment? And if people decided and said, like I said earlier, it's a matter of beliefs. And if on the one hand, countries and international communities are able to realize that, you know, it's a matter of choice. If someone is willing to accept to conform to particular health standards or not, why is it that they cannot recognize it in the same spirit when it comes to COVID? If for one instance, they are able to say, okay, we're going to leave Jehovah Witnesses alone if they are willing, if they have decided that their religion does not recognize blood transfusion. Why is it that they cannot accept religions nowadays that are saying, we believe our God is supreme, we believe in healing, we believe in this, and they're more hell-bent to listening to leaders who are saying, let us stay home. We're willing to give up our churches as places for beds and more hospital setups in our parking lots. So I think it's for us to impact on each and every one around us, our brothers, our sisters, our fathers and mothers, our neighbors, and tell them that this is the right thing to do. This is the thing that is going on. What is going on is a violation, and can you add your voice to whatever is being said in this space, in this arena, and say, we deserve our right to worship. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. I want to go to, we should be closing in the next 7 minutes, and I'll be giving the panelists a minute each to say their last remark, but that's after Mr. Simon Senyonga, human rights lawyer here in Kampala, give us his take on this way forward. Viola is saying what people fear is contracting the disease. How do you deal with the greater good narrative? Saying keeping churches closed is better for all, and hence many religions or many religious people are quick to comply, especially with the fear of the deadly variant. Simon, your quick take on this.
I think, number one, as I said earlier, that we have weaponized religion and instilled fear in the masses, especially the government. So what happens is that you keep people in a state of apathy and despondency because you think they cannot stand up for their rights. And this goes back to the way even the entire lockdown has been enforced against the places of worship, or generally, because you're having the military swinging in action, you're having the police swinging in action, you're having the, for example, local defense unit in the Ugandan context. But I love the approach that that Tendo talks about, and I think it is grounded in law. When you look at Article 3 of our Constitution, it talks about the need for resistance against anyone who violates the Constitution. Now, that's a place of law that, at least in the Ugandan context, we haven't largely explored and maximized. Even when we have attempted to explore and maximize it, the judiciary has been very quick to be on the guard by disputing it in reference to historical perspective. So number one, there is a need for actually popular resistance against unconstitutional acts of the government. Number two, at the core of the freedom of religion is the essence of being bold to stand up for what you believe in. Now, that is why it is actually very important, because that's the language that we seem to listen to in Uganda. But I will just end with this. There is a need for us also to do mass sensitization, even when we take litigation as a path. That litigation should be the starting point for us to make Ugandans realize that this is not a right standing alone. The principles of human rights do not change. That number one, they're inalienable, they're interdependent. That the moment you destroy the freedom, today they have come for the freedom of worship, tomorrow they will come for the next freedom of expression, they will come for the freedom of work, for those who benefit from actually religion and places of worship being open. So people need to realize that an affront to the freedom of worship is a subsequent affront to other fundamental human rights.
Okay, thank you very much. I have 5 minutes left, and I'm going to give 1 minute each to each of us. Please respect those 60 seconds. I want to begin with Anne and end with Lois, and then have Sean and Simon in between. I want to begin with a lady and end with a lady. But let me go to Anne. Your last word as we go out of here, please.
I beg your pardon?
Your last word in 45 seconds.
Okay. My last words, I would like to re-echo what I've said previously, that let us help each and everyone around us to see that what is going on right now is a violation. Number two, there's nothing to justify the statements that let us stay home and pray from home or pray via our TVs, because that is the most selfish thing I've ever had. Relatives down in the villages that do not have internet or even smartphones, do not have access to TV, are people whose right to freedom has actually been abused to the very root. So the limitations that are being imposed right now violate the right in its entirety. And as such, we need to let people know that what is going on is not right and it needs to change. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Sean, your very last word from DC.
Thank you, Gawai, and thanks to everybody and the other panelists. I think it really has just been a fantastic discussion, and thank you to all of you who joined in and made comments. Again, we'll hopefully uploading this very soon to YouTube once we get it, and please share that and speak out in favor of religious freedom in Uganda and around the world. I think that's the most important thing that you can do is just stand up and say, this is a fundamental thing. This is important to who I am. And it's important as well that we worship in community. I thought Simon made a great point at the end, which was just that, you know, a lot of times freedom of religion is the first thing that governments will attack. And if you give on that, they'll start going after freedom of expression. They'll go after other freedoms, other fundamental freedoms. And by the time you're done with that and you realize what you've lost, it's too late. Well, don't let it be too late. Really stand up for your freedom, stand up for your churches, stand up for your mosques, and say, hey, we can do this. We can worship safely, and we should be absolutely free to do that. So again, thank you to everyone here.
Great, thank you, Sean. And Simon, your passing shot.
All right, I just want to refer, really, I like the statement in the Supreme Court case of Shirul Mat. This was a 1954 case where the court said that religion covers all rituals and practices integral to religion. Our fight for the freedom of worship, or the freedom, you know, what you in broad terms call the freedom of religion, goes to the very core of protecting the very integral acts and practices that define us as a spiritual people. Now, it is very important that in this cause, no one should be diverted to actually think that by, you know, ceding ground to only a practice, then you're preserving a right. The ceding of ground for a practice subsequently leads to the ceding of the ground for anything that is very integral to this freedom of worship. So all of us, we should be very awake, very alert, and stand up and exercise our fundamental rights in resisting anything that's unconstitutional that limits our fundamental rights. Thank you.
Great, fantastic. Thank you, Simon. And last but not least, Lois.
Thank you, Gawai, and thank you also to the esteemed panel who I've had the privilege of discussing this important matter with. And I just want to echo those sentiments. When I was in Uganda just a month ago or so, I was struck by how religious freedom is not only a human right, but it's a Ugandan value. It's something that is integral to who you are, who I was introduced to as a people. And I think it's something beautiful, it's something right, and it's something really worth protecting. So I just thank you for all that you're doing to support religious freedom. We stand alongside you internationally at ADF International and supporting religious freedom. And yeah, I wish you the best for tomorrow. And I look forward to hearing what's going to happen next.
Great. I would like to say thank you very much to my panel. We've had Sean Nelson, Alliance Defending Freedom, USA. We've had Ann Tendo, Policy Advisor, Colonel here in Kampala, Uganda. We've had Lois Matlachi, Alliance Defending Freedom in Austria, And we've had Simon Senyonga, human rights lawyer here in Kampala, Uganda. And I have been Gawai Tegula, your moderator, talking about leading the discussion, protecting freedom of worship, reflections on closures of places of worship during COVID-19, a discussion, 3 continents, 4 or 5 countries. It's been fantastic. That's all we have time for today. Thank you for making time, everyone. God bless you, and have a fantastic day if you're in America, and have a fantastic evening if you're in Europe and Africa. Bye-bye from now.